So, before we can address the issue of morality without a supernatural lawgiver, the first thing I think we need to understand is that oftentimes when atheists and religious apologists, particularly those of a more fundamentalist leaning, debate morality and ethics, they arrive at their separate beliefs because they have two very different definitions of what moral behavior is and what attitude comprises ethical behavior. Atheist and humanist often begin with an assumption based on a foundational question that basically asks, what is the greatest tangible good and how can we deliver it to the most individuals? And what does the least amount of harm? In determining if an action is moral, they may ask, how am I helping or harming others? And if it is harmful, is that harm necessary? When asked by theists how morality could have arisen without an ultimate, i.e., divine, moral lawgiver, they will sometimes point to the way in which human beings evolved. When asked this question, I have personally answered it this way, or basically something like this. Human beings evolved as a communal species. We are interdependent on one another. The sharing of resources, knowledge, and skills is an effective means to ensure the preservation of the species and to maximize the quality of life for the greatest number of people. Cooperation and solid group cohesion has served humanity and other species well for a long time. Knowing that it makes sense not to do unnecessary harm to others and to help where I can. For in doing so, I increase not only the happiness and well-being of others, but my own as well. There's also the issue of empathy. Most of us have a gut-level visceral reaction when we see images of others enduring tremendous suffering, because mentally, we can put ourselves in their shoes and can reflect on how much we would hate to have those things happen to us. This creates the framework for the so-called ethics of reciprocity, which are often called the golden and silver rules among ethicists and other philosophers. We can behave kindly to one another and create a more just society without a God telling us to do so. The evidence of this is that something analogous to the golden rule or the silver rule has appeared in many cultures throughout history, apparently independently, as they were separated by thousands of miles and sometimes centuries of time. The assumption of many religious people, again, particularly those of the more fundamentalist Abrahamic faiths, is a very different assumption. Basically, their assumption about why we should follow these precepts, like don't murder, don't steal, and don't bear false witness, is not primarily because it helps others, but because of the God that has decreed it. This often flows from two base assumptions about their God's morality. One, God is omniscient and knows what is moral better than we do. Or two, God is the ultimate authority on anything and everything, so if he commands it, then that thing is moral, just on the basis of who and what he is. I'm going to particularly focus on number two, as usually some variations of this idea is what a biblical or Quranical literalist will argue if asked to account for the seemingly brutal acts that the Abrahamic God has either committed or cheerleaded in the scriptures. The problem with this thinking is that it encourages the use of the logical fallacy called special pleading. Example 1. Attacking a city and taking some of the captives back to your city as spoils of war, because the Aztec deity Huitzilopochtli condones it. Wicked and evil. Attacking a city and taking the captives back to your city as spoils of war because Allah condones it. Understandable and even defensible. Example 2. Being willing to kill your son because the ancient Palestinian deity Moloch wants you to sacrifice him. Heinous and cruel and possibly justification for genocide if the practice is widespread in a region. And the other side, being willing to kill your child because the ancient Palestinian deity Yahweh wants you to sacrifice them. Moral and noble, and a great example of praiseworthy faith. I have personally seen this when I have asked Christians that I know how they would react if they heard a voice that they were significantly convinced was the voice of their God telling them to kill their child. Quite a few of them responded that they would be willing to do so, when in any other context they would immediately recognize such an action as immoral. In this context, they are willing to do it. And I wish that I was only speaking from a hypothetical standpoint, but there have been times, even in recent history, where people have been willing to commit acts of violence against others, even their own children, because they were convinced that they were doing God's will. Now, of course, many theists will rightly condemn such people, saying that these individuals were not really hearing the voice of the true God, but that basically is the problem. When we open up this door that legitimizes the idea that people can have personal, special revelations and conversations with deities and messages from higher powers and basically supernatural voices speaking to them, then in a sense, we have legitimized any person saying God told them to do this, especially when we kind of take away the need for verified empirical means to confirm these things. If we basically say it's a supernatural thing, we don't need to confirm it with evidence, then we're basically saying that God can talk to people, and no matter how cruel or how violent it seems, it should be at least given respect and legitimacy. I will contend that on that basis alone, the ethical foundations of secular humanism are stronger than those of theistic ones. For the secular humanist does not need to rely on faith or anything not demonstratable to argue for the basis of his or her morality. We can demonstrate the rational basis for the source of morality that we believe in just by looking around us.